from a small town called Woodland in northeastern North Carolina. My home county, there are a little over 20,000 people, so when someone asks me where I'm from, I usually use reference points like Interstate 95 or Norfolk, Virginia. Northampton County consistently produces more timber than any other county in North Carolina. Northampton County is also one of the fastest depopulating counties in North Carolina, losing 10% of its population since the 2010 census. I've experienced firsthand the impacts of urbanization and the loss of jobs associated with the forest products industry on a rural community. Despite the slow and steady regression of the last few decades, there is reason for hope and excitement. In a neighboring county, one of the largest sawmills in North Carolina was recently constructed and will soon be in production. And in addition, the people that have moved from these rural areas into urban centers are looking for more opportunities to get outside. A burgeoning outdoor recreation economy is developing, capitalizing on the beauty provided by these natural resources. When I started in forestry 20 years ago, the impacts of forest conversion and fragmentation seemed to be issues that would be faced most directly by the next generation. There was ample time to adapt our land use practices to the growing challenges of increasing population and faith that the human population would adapt policies that would ensure a healthy environment for the next generation. Large forested landscapes would carry on, continuing to be managed by forest products companies providing the forest products that we rely on. Unfortunately, with each passing year, our ability to avoid serious negative impacts from climate change and environmental degradation become less certain. Forest conservation is the best tool we have to mitigate continued environmental decline. Forests are also one of the most cost-efficient and scalable solutions we have to climate change. They are one of the planet's best carbon sinks, and by protecting and restoring them, we reduce net carbon emissions, meet climate goals, and introduce resiliency into the landscape. Scientists expect that for each ton of emissions, there will be $100 of societal cost. Forests also supply about 60% of the nation's drinking water supply, supplying over 200 million people and 68,000 people. Forests are an essential tool to providing the water quality and quantity that our nation needs. With increasing population, more extreme weather, lessening reserves, and increased demand, forests must be a key focus of any water sustainability and climate resilient strategy. Never in our nation's history have we experienced such a rapid loss of our privately owned working forest. The loss rate from 1982 until now has been over 500,000 acres per year and is projected to be 900,000 acres per year through 2060. As these large ownerships are broken into smaller pieces, the ecological and economic benefits provided by these forests are lost. This map of Maine provides a great illustration of the changes in forest land ownership over time. Starting on the left, in 1994, the area in red represents the land owned in Maine by vertically integrated forest products companies. Moving to the right, by 2005, the area in blue shows the ownership that had transitioned to real estate investment trust or REITs or other financial investment institutions. By 2009, only a fraction of the industrially owned timberland remained. While there's nothing inherently wrong with financial investment-related timberland ownership, as these forests are fragmented into smaller ownerships with disparate management regimes, it erodes the integrity of these forests. Wildlife habitat corridors providing access routes for animal species that are adapting to climate change are interrupted. Smaller ownerships are created as higher and better use land is identified, and harvest schedules are driven more by investor return than the sustainable productivity of these forests. The forestry community is perhaps best positioned to provide the map for these rural communities and isolated towns to transition into a stronger, adaptive, and more resilient community. There are many pieces to this puzzle: innovative new forest products providing substitutes for petroleum products and other greenhouse contributing construction materials, a reimagining of the value of forests with a more equitable and knowledgeable landowner base investing in natural resource based businesses. The success of any or all of these pieces relies on one fundamental thing: maintaining our forests intact, healthy, and working. Large, privately owned forests provide a critical anchor for the health and vibrancy of these rural communities. These large, privately owned forests form the backbone of these forest-dependent communities. These ownerships are usually tens of thousands of acres in size. I would submit to you that working forest conservation easements are the best tool that we have to protect these last remaining large ownerships. So what is a conservation easement? Despite the millions of acres across the United States that are protected by conservation easements, this tool is not well understood. Conservation easements are not singular in their use or impact, and they do not necessarily create forest preserves. A conservation easement is a flexible tool that can produce conservation outcomes while maintaining land in private ownership and own the county's tax roll, a crucial source of revenue for these rural counties. The most basic conservation easement would simply prevent change in land use or subdivision, but conservation easements can be more prescriptive. They can enshrine in a more formal and permanent legal document best management practices, or they could have more specific management requirements that facilitate wildlife habitat or outdoor recreation. Traditionally, conservation easements have been used to protect small parcels or smaller portions of large ownerships. We need to reimagine how this tool can be used to protect the last remaining large privately owned forest. Apple recently provided grant funding to protect 36,000 acres of forest in Maine and North Carolina. The timber harvested from this property will offset the virgin fiber used in Apple's paper and packaging. Most consumers use forest certification as a measure of the sustainability of the forest products that they use, but forest certification is limited by the tenure of the current landowner. There is nothing in forest certification that prevents the land use conversion or subdivision. Hopefully, this groundbreaking work will spur a higher level of corporate responsibility and motivate others to follow suit. Forest landowners have anticipated that ecosystem services would provide emerging markets that would provide an avenue of revenue for the benefits, the public benefits provided by these forests. But unfortunately, the regulatory framework necessary to spur these markets has been slow to develop. In the age of social media, consumers are holding corporations to a higher level of responsibility, and hopefully Apple's example can show how forest offsets can be combined with private philanthropy to produce real conservation results. Here in Georgia, the state is purchasing conservation easements that not only prevent land use conversion and subdivision, they also more specifically provide habitat for the gopher tortoise. The gopher tortoise is a keystone species whose burrows provide habitat for 360 other species, including eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, rabbits, skunks, and the threatened indigo snake. These easements require that a certain portion of the property be maintained in longleaf pine habitat and prescribed burning. One of the most important aspects of this initiative is to prevent the gopher tortoise from becoming a federally listed endangered species. If the gopher tortoise were to become a federally listed endangered species, it could have a significant impact on the Georgia economy. Everything from commercial development to agriculture, timber production, and also importantly, the training mission on Georgia military bases. These easements provide permanent public outdoor recreation while maintaining the timber production on these properties. In the state of West Virginia, they are purchasing conservation easements to facilitate the reintroduction of elk. The history of West Virginia has largely been shaped by coal. In 1950, there were 125,000 pick and shovel miners. But in the 50s, mechanization reduced the number of miners needed to extract the same amount of coal. And the number of approximately 70,000 workers lost their jobs and fled north along the Hillbilly Highway to places like Akron and Cleveland. The number of workers continued to drop to the 70s when long-wall machines could produce 10 times as much coal with half as many workers. That employment number continued to drop. In the 90s, there were about 30,000 workers, and today the state puts that figure at 12,000. By comparison, forestry and related industries support over 30,000 jobs in the state of West Virginia, contributing over $3 billion to their economy. In December of 2016, 24 elk were released in West Virginia, reintroducing a species that had been absent since 1875. West Virginia is hoping to copy the success of their neighbor Kentucky. In Kentucky, elk and other wildlife viewing supports over 11,000 jobs and contributes over $600 million annually to the Kentucky economy. Hopefully this work will help to mitigate the impact of the loss of jobs associated with the coal mining industry. In addition to the area that was where a conservation easement was purchased, the state of West Virginia also purchased an area in fee in the middle of this easement area. Conservation easements are an effective tool to produce conservation results, but they're not perfect for every situation. In many instances, the public objectives are either too cumbersome or too prescriptive to be maintained in private ownership. In this instance, the state wanted to install infrastructure to help and facilitate tourism associated with the elk herd. They wanted to construct a welcome center on the property. There are numerous examples of conservation easements being used to protect the viewshed along the Appalachian Trail. The use of these conservation easements maintains or ensures the continued use of the trail by hikers and the economic impact that these hikers have on communities adjacent to the trail. These easements do not necessarily restrict forest management practices, and they maintain land in private ownership, which is really important to these county governments where a large portion of the county is already in public ownership and no longer on the tax roll. The use of working forest conservation easements to protect these last remaining large forests is not without its challenges. The current level of public and private conservation funding available falls short of the need in the face of climate change and growing population. We need a much higher level of private philanthropy if we hope to successfully confront these issues and provide a healthy environment to our children. In addition, landowners that are considering a working forest conservation easement need to be sure that they're working with an entity that can successfully inspect and enforce the requirements of the easement. This can best be accomplished by working with an entity that has been accredited through the Land Trust Alliance. Equally important and often overlooked is making sure that a sufficient endowment is provided to the easement holder so that in the future they can inspect and, if necessary, defend the requirements of the conservation easement. This is necessary to ensure the permanence of the conservation easement. Landowners also need to be careful about the language in a conservation easement. As conservation easements become more restrictive, the ability to determine if a landowner is in compliance becomes more costly. In addition, as easements become more restrictive, the value of the underlying fee is reduced and the ability to maintain that property as a working forest becomes more difficult. We are losing our forests at an accelerating rate just as we need them the most. Forests are the best tool that we have to provide the clean air and water that we need. We need to act now, and I believe that working forest conservation easements are the best tool that we have.